Let me ask you something. Simple question. If your main source of income disappeared tomorrow, how long would you be okay? A month? A few weeks? Less? For most people. The honest answer is uncomfortable because most people have built their entire financial life on one single source, one job, one paycheck, one company's decision about whether they still have a role tomorrow. And here's the thing. The wealthy don't do this, not because they're smarter, not because they got lucky, because somewhere along the way, they understood something that most people never stop to think about. Today, we're going to talk about that. Not theory, not motivation, the actual strategy behind how real financial security gets built. This is the bigger picture. Let's talk about risk for a second. Not the kind of risk people usually think about, not stock market risk, not is this investment safe risk. A different kind, the kind that almost nobody calculates because it doesn't feel like risk at all. It feels like normal life. Here's what I mean. If someone told you, I want you to put everything you have into one single investment, no diversification, no backup, just everything into one thing, you'd probably say that sounds reckless. Most people would. We've all heard the phrase, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's one of those pieces of advice that everyone nods along to, everyone agrees with it, and then almost everyone does exactly that. Not with their investments, with their income. Think about it. For most people, 100% of their income comes from one place, one employer, one role, one decision maker, who isn't them. That is, by definition, all their eggs in one basket. And here's what makes this particularly strange. People will spend hours researching which stock to buy, reading reviews before choosing a fund, agonizing over a few percentage points of return, while the thing that actually determines whether they can pay rent next month, whether they can cover an emergency, whether they're okay if something goes wrong, sits entirely in one basket that they never examine at all. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about quitting your job. It isn't about telling you that having a job is wrong or that everyone needs to become an entrepreneur or any of that. A stable job is genuinely valuable. It provides structure, routine, often benefits, often community. The issue isn't the job itself. The issue is concentration. Let me give you a way to think about this. Imagine your income as a portfolio, just like an investment portfolio. Right now, and for most people, that portfolio has one holding, one position, 100% allocation to a single asset. And here's what we know about portfolios like that. When that one asset performs well, everything is fine, more than fine. But when something happens to that one asset, a layoff, a company restructuring, an industry shift, there's nothing else. No second position to fall back on, and no smaller stream that's still running while the main one gets sorted out. Just a sudden complete stop. And here's the part that I think is genuinely important to understand. This isn't a hypothetical. This happens to real people constantly. Industries shift, companies restructure, roles become redundant. Often, for reasons that have nothing to do with how well someone was doing their job, and when it happens, the person with one income source goes from everything is fine to everything is at risk in a single conversation. Now compare that to someone with a second income stream, even a small one, even something that on its own wouldn't be enough to live on. When the main income stops, they're not at zero. They're not starting from nothing. They have something running, something that buys time, something that turns a crisis into an inconvenience. That difference between zero and something is enormous, not in dollar terms necessarily, in what it does to how the situation feels, and in what it does to the decisions someone makes during that time. Someone with nothing often has to take the first thing available, any job, any terms, just something immediately. Someone with a second stream has options. They can be selective. They can wait for the right opportunity instead of the desperate one. That's not a small difference. That's often the difference between a setback and a genuine derailment. So the question becomes, how do you actually build that second stream without it taking over your life, without quitting your job, without pretending you're suddenly an entrepreneur? That's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So, where do you actually start? Because get a second income stream sounds nice, but it's vague, and vague advice almost never gets acted on, so let's make it specific. There are really 3 categories, not 50 options, not an overwhelming list. 3, and understanding these 3 changes how you think about every opportunity you come across from here on. The first category is what I'd call skill-based income. This is the most accessible one, by far, because it doesn't require capital you don't have, or an asset you need to buy first. It requires something you already have, a skill, something you already know how to do, that other people would pay for. Maybe it's something from your job, maybe it's something from a hobby, maybe it's something so familiar to you that you've never even considered it valuable. Here's the thing about skill-based income. It starts almost immediately. Someone needs what you know, you provide it. You get paid, simple, direct. But here's also the limitation. It's still you trading time for money, just in a second place now instead of just one, which makes it a great starting point, but not by itself the destination. The second category is asset-based income. This is where something you own generates income, somewhat independent of your time. Now, I know what you might be thinking. I don't have assets to rent out. And for many people, that's true right now. But here's what's worth understanding. Asset-based income usually doesn't start with buying something new. It starts with looking at what you already have differently. A spare room, a vehicle that sits unused most of the week, equipment you own for one purpose that could serve another. The principle is the same in every case. Something you already own starts generating value beyond its original purpose. This category requires more thought than the first, but it requires less new capital than people assume. The third category is what I'd call creation-based income. This is the one people get most excited about, and also the one that takes the longest to produce results. It's the idea of building something once that can generate income repeatedly without you rebuilding it each time. A piece of content, a small digital product, a system someone else can use. Here's the honest truth about this category. It has the lowest cost to start and the highest patience required. Most things in this category produce nothing for a while, sometimes a long while, and then, if they work, they can produce results disproportionate to the effort that went into creating them once. Now, here's what I want you to notice about these 3 categories. They're not equally accessible. For most people, starting out, skill-based income is where it begins, not because it's the best long-term, but because it's the only one that doesn't require capital or an asset or months of unpaid effort before any return. It's the entry point, the thing that gets a second stream running while you figure out the rest. And here's something important. The goal isn't to stay in skill-based income forever. The goal is to use it as a bridge. The income it generates doesn't have to go toward lifestyle. Remember the gap we talked about before? This is exactly where it applies again. Income from a second stream can become the capital that eventually builds the second category, asset-based income, which over time can fund the third, creation-based income. Each stream feeding the next. Not all at once, not overnight, but in sequence. And that sequence is the actual strategy, not do everything at once. Start with what's accessible, let it fund what's next. In the next part of this conversation, we're going to talk about the most common reason this never happens. Even for people who understand all of this completely, let me make this more concrete, because categories on their own can feel abstract. So let's put faces on them. Not real people, just examples, the kind of situation you might recognize. Skill-based income first. Think of someone who's spent 15 years doing a specific job, maybe something with numbers or writing or organizing complex things. They've never thought of that skill as something separate from their job. It's just what they do for their employer. But here's the thing, that same skill often has value outside that one employer. Other businesses, smaller ones usually, need exactly that, a few hours a week, help with something they can't justify hiring someone full-time for. This person already has the skill, they just never offered it anywhere else. That's skill-based income, not a new skill, the same one, offered a second time. Now, asset-based. Think of someone with a spare room, used occasionally, mostly empty, or a vehicle that sits in a driveway most of the week, or specialized equipment bought for one project years ago, now just stored. None of these were bought as investments, they were bought for their original purpose, but each of them could generate some income in their unused time, not transforming a life, just an asset that was sitting idle, starting to do something, and creation-based last. This one's harder to make concrete, because it usually starts smaller than people expect. Think of someone who's answered the same question for colleagues, friends, family, probably dozens of times over the years, something they understand well enough, that people keep asking them about it. That repeated question was often the seed, a simple explanation, written once, organized once, something that could help. The next person who has that same question, without that person needing to ask directly. Small, unglamorous, often free at first, but it's the beginning of something that can exist without requiring the same time every single time. Here's what I want you to notice. None of these examples required quitting anything. None of them required capital that doesn't exist. None of them required a brilliant original idea. They required looking at what's already there. A skill already used somewhere else, an asset already owned, a question already answered, repeatedly. The strategy isn't about creating something from nothing. It's about noticing what's already present and giving it a second purpose. Let's be honest about something. Almost everyone who hears what we just talked about agrees with it, makes sense, sounds reasonable. 3 categories, start with skills, build from there, and then nothing happens. Months pass, sometimes years, and the second income stream never starts. So let's talk about why. Because if we don't address this directly, everything else is just information. Interesting, forgettable. Information. The first reason is the most common one. I don't have time, and I want to take this seriously, because for a lot of people, it's genuinely true. Work, family, commitments that already fill every hour. The idea of adding something else feels impossible. But here's what I want you to consider. The question isn't really, do I have time? The question is, what am I comparing this to? Because here's what happens for most people with the time that exists. After work, in the evening, on a Sunday afternoon, that time doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere, often to things that don't move anything forward. Not because those things are bad. Rest matters, entertainment matters, downtime matters. But if we're honest, for most people, there's at least some time that isn't protected by anything important. It's just default time filled by whatever's easiest in the moment. And the question becomes, could even a small piece of that be redirected? Not all of it. Not in a way that eliminates rest or family time or things that matter. Just some of it. An hour a few times a week. Here's why that matters more than it sounds like it should. Most second income streams don't require huge blocks of time to start. They require small, consistent blocks over a long period. The skill-based income we talked about often starts with just a few hours a week, not because that's all it takes to succeed, but because that's enough to start. And starting is the part that almost never happens. The second reason this doesn't happen is what I'd call the big idea trap. This is sneaky because it looks like ambition. It sounds like someone who's thinking big. Here's how it shows up. Someone decides they want a second income stream, and instead of starting with something small, accessible, already within reach, they start looking for the idea, the big one, the one that could really change things. And so they wait, they research, they think, they consider options, and every small, accessible thing gets dismissed. That's too small to matter. That's not really what I want to do. I should wait until I find something better. Meanwhile, nothing starts, not the small thing, not the big thing, nothing. Here's the truth about this, the big idea. When it does work out for people, almost never comes from sitting and thinking about it. It comes from doing something small, something accessible, something that seemed at the time like just a starting point. And somewhere along the way, while doing that small thing, something else became visible, an opportunity that wasn't visible before starting. This is consistent enough that it's almost a rule. Clarity comes from action, not the other way around. Waiting for clarity before acting is waiting for something that arrives by acting. So here's what this means practically. The second income stream that matters most isn't the perfect one. It's the one that actually starts, even if it's small, even if it's not the thing, even if 6 months from now it's not even what you're still doing, because what it does, in the meantime, is begin the sequence we talked about. The first stream, funding the next, and in the next part of this conversation, we're going to talk about what happens when that sequence actually starts running. Let's say it starts small, nothing dramatic, a few hours a week, using a skill you already have. What actually happens over time? Let me walk you through it. In the beginning, it feels almost insignificant. A little extra money, some weeks more, some weeks less, nothing that changes your life in any visible way. And honestly, at this stage, most people quit. Not because it failed, because it felt small. And small doesn't feel like progress. But here's what's actually happening underneath. Remember the gap we talked about, the space between what comes in and what goes out. A second income stream widens that gap directly, immediately. And if that extra income doesn't get absorbed into lifestyle, if it goes instead toward the gap, something starts. Let's put a number on this. Say the second stream brings in an extra $300 a month. Modest, realistic, the kind of number that doesn't feel impressive. If that $300 goes into the same kind of investment we've discussed before, at a historical average return, over 20 years, that becomes well over $150,000 from $300 a month. From something that in year one felt almost too small to mention. But here's where it gets more interesting. Remember the three categories: skill-based, asset-based, creation-based. What if, instead of investing all of that $300, some of it goes toward building the second category, toward an asset, something that itself starts generating income? Now you have two things compounding: the investment account growing on its own, and a second asset starting to produce its own income, which can, in turn, fund the third category. This is the sequence, not linear, not one and done. Each stream feeding into the next, while also continuing to run on its own. And here's the thing about sequences like this. In year one, it looks like almost nothing. In year 5, it looks like meaningful progress. In year 15, 20, it often looks like an entirely different financial life, not because of one big decision, because of one small decision that kept compounding in multiple directions at once. Now, I want to address something. This isn't a promise that everyone who starts a second income stream ends up with multiple thriving businesses and total financial independence. That's not realistic, and it's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the difference between someone with one income source and someone with even two modest ongoing sources compounds into something much larger than the initial gap would suggest. Not just in money, in resilience, in options, in what happens when something goes wrong with the main source. Someone with one stream and a disruption starts from zero. Someone with two or three, even small ones, starts from somewhere and somewhere. Compounded over years, becomes a completely different trajectory. This is, in many ways, the actual strategy that wealthy people use. Not some secret investment, not some special access. Multiple streams, started small, fed into each other, given time. The same mechanism we've talked about in every conversation, just applied to income itself, not only to what's done with it afterward. And in the final part of this conversation, we're going to talk about how this fits into a life that's already full, because that's the part most people are actually wondering about. Let's talk about something practical now, because everything we've discussed so far makes sense in theory, but theory doesn't account for a full-time job, a family, responsibilities that already fill every day. So let's address that directly. The first thing I want to say is this isn't permanent. What I mean is, the period where you're building a second income stream isn't the rest of your life. It's a season, a few hours a week, for a period of time, with a purpose. Not this is my life now, forever. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. Because most people, when they think about adding something to an already full life, imagine it as permanent, as a new ongoing weight added to everything else indefinitely. And under that framing, it's almost impossible to start. Who would willingly add a permanent burden to a life that's already full? But that's not what this actually is. It's a season with an end point. Not end as in you stop forever. End as in the nature of it changes. The skill-based income that took active hours eventually feeds an asset. The asset starts generating income with less ongoing time. The active phase transitions into something more passive. This is the sequence again, but viewed through time, not just money. Now here's the second thing, about protecting what matters. I'm not going to pretend that building a second income stream costs nothing. It costs something. Time, some energy, some attention that could go elsewhere. The question is, where does that cost come from? And this is where intention matters. If the time comes from family time, sleep, things that genuinely matter to your well-being, that's not sustainable. It might work for a few weeks. It won't work for the years this actually takes. But if the time comes from the default time we talked about before, the scrolling, the shows that don't really matter, the hours that disappear without anyone really choosing them, then the cost is different. It's not less of what matters, it's less of what wasn't really chosen anyway. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because most people, when they audit their week, honestly, find more of that second kind of time than they expected. Not hours and hours, but some. Often, enough. The third thing I want to say is about pace. This doesn't need to be intense. It doesn't need to be 5 hours every single day for months. In fact, that pace rarely survives contact with real life. What survives is something smaller. A few hours, a few times a week. Consistent, sustainable, the kind of pace that doesn't require heroics. Because here's what we know about the compounding we discussed. It doesn't reward intensity, it rewards duration. $300 a month for 20 years. Beats $3,000 for 2 months, followed by nothing. Every time. The tortoise, not the hare. Slow, consistent, still running. Long after the burst of motivation that started it has faded. So here's the practical version of everything we've discussed. Pick something accessible, a skill you already have. Give it a few hours a week, time that wasn't doing much anyway. Let it run. Don't expect much at first. Redirect what it generates toward the next stream and give it years. Not because years are required to see anything, but because years are required to see what it actually becomes. If you're still here, I want to pause for a second, because what we've talked about today isn't flashy. It's not quit your job and become rich. It's not a get-rich-quick anything. It's something quieter and I think more useful. We talked about risk, not market risk, income risk. The fact that most people have 100% of their financial life resting on one single source. We talked about the three categories: skill-based, asset-based, creation-based, and how they're not equal, but they connect, one feeding the next. We talked about why this doesn't happen, not lack of information, time that feels unavailable, and a search for the big idea that keeps the small, accessible thing from ever starting. We talked about what happens when it does start, how something that feels insignificant compounds in ways that aren't visible until years have passed. And we talked about how this fits into a life that's already full, not as a permanent addition, as a season with an endpoint where the nature of it changes. That's the framework. And like everything else we've discussed, it doesn't require you to have wealth already to begin. It requires a few hours and a decision about where those hours go. If something in this conversation landed differently, if something here felt like it applied to you specifically, I'd invite you to stay close to this channel, subscribe, so the next conversation reaches you when it's ready. Not for hype, not for someone telling you what to buy, for the kind of understanding that compounds the way good decisions do, slowly at first, then not so slowly. And share this with someone who's never thought about this, someone whose entire financial life rests on one place, one decision maker who isn't them. This conversation might be what shifts that. And now, let's finish what we started, because there's one more piece, not a category, not a number, something that determines whether any of this actually happens, not the strategy, the reason. I want to end with something simple. Everything we talked about today, the risk, the categories, the sequence, the pace, all of it is mechanics and mechanics on their own. Rarely survive the first difficult month. What survives is a reason. So let me ask you something. Why does this actually matter to you? Not in general, specifically. For some people, the answer is about a moment that already happened. A layoff, a company that didn't make it, a situation where one income source disappeared and there was nothing else. If that's you, you already know exactly why this matters. You don't need convincing. For other people, the answer is about a moment that hasn't happened yet, but could. A quiet awareness that everything currently depends on one thing continuing exactly as it is, and a sense that this isn't quite as solid as it feels. If that's you, this is the moment, before the moment. The time when something can actually be done before it becomes urgent. For others still, this isn't about fear at all. It's about something else. Options. The simple, quiet fact of having more than one way forward. Not because anything is wrong, just because more than one path feels different than one path. It feels like choice. Whatever your reason is, I'd encourage you to actually name it. Not vaguely, specifically. Write it down, if that helps. Because here's what that reason does. On the weeks when starting feels like too much, when the few hours feel like they could go somewhere easier, that reason is what brings you back. Not motivation. Motivation fades. A reason that's actually yours doesn't. Here's what I want you to take from today. You don't need to change your life this week. You don't need to quit anything. You don't need a big idea. You need one small thing, something you already know how to do, a few hours that exist somewhere in your week, and a decision about where the result of those hours goes. That's it. That's the entire starting point. Everything else, the second category, the third, the compounding, the years, all of that comes later. It comes because the first small thing started. The best time to start this Was years ago the second best time? Is now. Not because conditions are perfect, they're probably not, but because every month this waits is a month the sequence doesn't begin, and the sequence is the entire point. If this conversation has been worth your time, share it with someone who's never thought about this, someone whose entire financial life depends on one thing. They deserve to think about it before they have to. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking of starting or what's been stopping you, because the next conversation starts with what you need most. This is the bigger picture: money, wealth, and the life you're building. We'll see you in the next one.